In the past 3 decades, China has become one of the biggest mechanisms that makes civilization prosper. China is one of the biggest nuclear powers, it has one of the best well-equipped armies in the world. China is also undoubtedly the biggest supplier of cheap goods and electronics in the world as well. Even the mobile phone, tablet or computer you're watching this video on is most likely made in China. As much as China has become this powerful and influential, it has its own very serious internal constraints and problems which are not well known to people outside of China. So this is the finale of China's geographic and geopolitical weaknesses series. The first 2 parts are in the description below, you can check them out later. Episodes are not interconnected, so you can watch them individually and not miss anything. Wealth has always been the defining characteristic of Chinese civilizations, but historically, this has been due to the vast profusion of natural resources the country has been blessed with. Emperor Qianlong of the last dynasty, the Qing, professed to British envoy, "Our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its borders. There is, therefore, no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians in exchange for our own produce." China was, for most of its existence, an incredibly self-sufficient economic entity, and this accounted for much of its insular foreign policy. Trade was conducted to acquire luxury goods rather than necessities. Its interactions with the rest of East Asia mostly had to do with imperial tribute. Now, however, the modern Chinese nation-state is deeply integrated into the global economy and reliant on global commerce, particularly for food and energy. Since the 1990s, China has been a net importer of grain and oil and became a net importer of coal in 2008. It is set to become the world's largest oil and gas importer according to the International Energy Agency. By 2040, China will account for almost 30% of the oil being traded internationally and almost 25% of liquefied natural gas traded over long distances. Never before has the prosperity of China been so inextricably bound up with international trade and so dependent on the fortunes and goodwill of other nations. So China's economic success has come at the cost of its self-sufficiency. As the 2008 crisis showed, the Chinese economy is vulnerable to contagion and all the problems that being part of the global economy entail. What's more, much of this trade is conducted not overland, as has traditionally been the case, but across the oceans. As you can see, much of this trade transits the South China Sea and specifically the Strait of Malacca, through which about 25% of the world trade passes. This is problematic for a country that has, for much of its history, been a land power that has displayed only periodic and cursory interest in the maritime realm. It does not have much enduring, established seafaring or naval traditions and expertise, and these take time to cultivate. Beijing understands that its supply chains and maritime lines of commerce and communication remain vulnerable. Expanded vital commercial interests overseas demand a proportionate naval capability to defend those interests, which China is still developing. Currently, as much as they deny it, the Chinese and the rest of East Asia have been relying on the US military presence in the Asia-Pacific to provide security for their maritime trade. China's trade routes and access to international markets and resources could potentially be intercepted or disrupted by the US. This is the imperative that is therefore driving the PRC to develop a formidable navy and to seek out alternative trade routes through its Belt and Road Initiative to diversify away from the single point of vulnerability called maritime trade. But the modern China's preoccupation with the sea goes beyond the economic security. It is also concerned with the physical security of the Han core. The coastline and the adjacent seas have proven to be dangerous geographical weaknesses in the past 200 years. Until now, China has always been a continental land power by nature. The state's attention was largely focused inland on maintaining control of the buffers, fighting off barbarian incursions, and holding the Han core together. Trade was conducted mostly overland, for example Silk Road trade routes leading into Central Asia and to Persia and the West. China had no need for navies. If you are interested in history, you know that China once had one of the best navies in the world, but in a small interval of history. For example, this is Chinese explorer Zheng He's ship compared to Christopher Columbus's Santa Maria. They both lived in the same era. And piracy in the East China Sea was an annoyance, and the Song dynasty did develop an impressive navy for use against the Jin. But for the most part, naval power was a curiosity, an indulgence. There was no major impulse to use its maritime power to engage with the rest of the world like the Europeans did. Navies were built in times of prosperity and then burned when they could no longer be maintained in times of strife. To the European powers, the maritime domain meant connectivity and possibility. But to the Chinese, for much of their history, East and South China Seas were for the most part just buffers rather than a medium for interaction. So the coastline was basically a wall. The last 2 centuries showed the proof of this assumption. During the Qin dynasty, European gunboats blasted their way into Chinese markets, seizing control of the Qin ports, and then later, Imperial Japan destroyed the fledgling Chinese navy at sea and then invaded across the East China Sea, seizing large swaths of the coastal provinces. China had learned through bitter experience that its coastline and the adjacent seas were no longer safe spaces. This physical military threat to the security of the core has receded somewhat in recent decades, but the memory of the Opium Wars and the Sino-Japanese Wars, where an enemy sea power wrested control of the adjacent East and South China Seas, attained a grip on its coastline, carved away huge chunks of coastal territory along with its precious ports, and then proceeded inland to dismember the core and massacre the populace. Chinese sensitivity to incursions and encroachment on its surrounding seas and coastline by foreign powers is therefore understandable from a national security viewpoint. In Beijing's quest to develop a naval capability, it has run up against a natural barrier in the form of the first and second island chains. The coast of China is encircled by a series of archipelagic bodies which serve to circumscribe the growth of the Chinese sea power. From a purely geostrategic standpoint, these island chains could sustain a network of military bases from which an unfriendly foreign power could project military force into the South and East China Seas, a maritime Great Wall around China's periphery. To expand into the Indian and Pacific Oceans, Chinese sea power would have to first contend with these geographical barriers. For foreign powers seeking to contain Chinese naval power, the island chains are pre-built, permanent geostrategic outposts and fortifications enclosing the South and East China Seas and the Western Pacific. Between the archipelagos there exist multiple narrow passages or crucial maritime choke points that in a time of confrontation could be blockaded by a foreign power, severing the vital arteries of Chinese maritime trade. These choke points include most notably the Strait of Malacca, but also the Korea Strait, the Sunda Strait, the Lombok Strait, the Karimata Strait, the Balabac Strait, and the Mindoro Strait. This geographical noose around the neck of the Chinese economy has become a fixation of the Chinese strategists. Currently, most of these states are allied to or on friendly terms with the US. America has strategic and security partnerships with Singapore and Taiwan. Among others, Vietnam is also pivoting towards Washington and fairly nervous about Chinese assertiveness in international waters. A few of them already host US military bases, so the US presence is heavily concentrated permanently in Northeast Asia, but in Southeast Asia, its military presence is lighter and mostly on a rotational basis. For most of the Cold War, China was preoccupied with its internal turmoil and the traditional land power mentality held sway, with the central government's attention focused on the interior. With the end of the Cold War and the resurgence of China as a modern great power and a potential superpower, with its maritime commerce and increasingly forceful behavior at sea, this idea gained new credence and attention. Now, Beijing seeks to disrupt the coherence of the US-Asian alliances and so degrade the island chains, breaking out into the Indo-Pacific. Washington may seek to proceed with its policy of containment and engagement, while rebalancing its military, economic, and diplomatic resources and assets to the Asia-Pacific. The states that comprise the island chains will be central to this strategic interplay. What do you think about China, its geography, and its future? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. This episode is brought to you with the help of these Patreon supporters. If you want to support this channel, head over to Patreon, and thanks to everyone who's supporting. Thanks for watching. This was the finale of Chinese Geographical Weaknesses series. More interesting videos are coming up. Please subscribe and hit the like button.